Have you ever looked at a clock and felt certain that only minutes had passed, only to realize hours had slipped away without reason? Or maybe you've experienced the opposite, where an entire afternoon seemed to vanish in the blink of an eye, leaving you wondering if reality itself had bent around you. Time is supposed to be steady, a constant rhythm that carries us from one moment to the next. But for some people, in moments tied to the unexplainable and the paranormal, time behaves like something alive, stretching, snapping, looping back on itself in ways that defy every law we know. Tonight, you're going to hear three real stories from people who stepped into moments like these, where the clock wasn't just wrong, it was impossible. From a motel that swallowed 2 full days to a ghostly train that arrived before it departed, to a house where seconds and years blurred into the same breath. These accounts are more than strange coincidences. They are glimpses into something we're not meant to understand. So settle in, because once you start listening, you might just find yourself wondering how much time has really passed since you pressed play. It was just past midnight when David finally gave up on the highway. The road ahead had turned into a long, hypnotic ribbon of black asphalt, and the steady hum of the tires was making his eyelids feel heavier with every passing mile. He had been driving since early morning, crossing state lines to close a deal that had taken far longer than he'd planned. His phone was almost dead, his GPS was glitching, and every town he'd passed in the last hour seemed to have been swallowed by darkness. That was when he saw it, a flickering neon sign in the distance, half hidden behind a row of skeletal trees. Pinewood Motel, it read in patchy red letters buzzing faintly against the cold night air. It wasn't much, but it was better than falling asleep at the wheel. Pulling into the cracked parking lot, David noticed how still everything was. No hum of traffic from the road, no chirp of crickets, just the wind scraping dead leaves across the pavement. The building looked old, maybe from the late 60s, with a flat roof and faded mint green paint peeling away in strips. A single light burned in the front office, and behind the desk sat a man who looked like he hadn't moved in hours. His skin had a pale, waxy sheen, and his eyes seemed too bright, locked on David the moment he stepped inside. There was no greeting, just a slow turn of the register and a set of keys pushed across the counter. David muttered a thanks, trying not to notice that the man hadn't blinked once. The paperwork he signed was already filled out, his name, the date, though he was sure he hadn't told the clerk anything yet. Room 6 was halfway down the hall. The key was the old-fashioned kind, brass and heavy, attached to a cracked plastic tag. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. The wallpaper was yellowed, curling at the edges, and the bedspread was a deep maroon that seemed to swallow the light from the single lamp. On the nightstand, an alarm clock sat with its red digits frozen at 2:14 a.m. David tapped it once, nothing. He shrugged it off, plugged his phone into the wall, and lay down fully clothed. He could faintly hear music somewhere in the building, soft, scratchy, like an old radio playing in another room. Sleep came quickly, but the dreams were strange. He was walking down an endless hallway lined with motel doors, each one slightly ajar. From behind them came muffled voices, fragments of conversation, and an occasional laugh that didn't sound entirely human. When he tried to open one of the doors, his hand passed straight through the knob, and he'd find himself back in his own room, the clock still frozen at 2:14. The hallway stretched on, until the soft music swelled into something sharper, discordant, and he woke with a jolt. Sunlight was streaming through the curtains, brighter than it had any right to be. Blinking, he reached for his phone, expecting to see that maybe he'd overslept by an hour or two. But the date on the lock screen made him sit bolt upright. 2 days had passed, not hours, days. There were 17 missed calls from his boss, 6 from his sister, and dozens of text messages asking where he was. His heart hammered in his chest as he stumbled to the window, half expecting to see the parking lot still the way he'd left it. But something was wrong. The pavement was cracked and buckled, weeds sprouting between the fissures. The vending machine by the office was gone, the lights in the lobby off. David grabbed his bag and headed for the front desk, but when he pushed open the door, the lobby was empty. Dust coated the counters and the register was gone. The chair where the clerk had sat was tipped on its side, one leg broken. In the corner, a calendar hung crooked, the year printed at the top more than a decade old. His breath fogged in the cold air as he stepped outside, looking around for any sign of life. The neon sign that had drawn him in was gone. Just rusted metal poles standing like bones against the pale sky. Panic clawed at him now. He sprinted to his car, but the hood was coated in a fine layer of dirt, as though it had been sitting there untouched for years. His phone had no signal. He thought about knocking on one of the other room doors, but couldn't shake the feeling that if someone answered, it wouldn't be anyone he wanted to meet. His gaze drifted to the office window, where, for just a moment, he thought he saw the pale clerk watching him, unblinking as before. But when he looked again, the window was dark. Driving away was like emerging from a fog. A few miles down the road, he spotted a small diner and pulled in, desperate for some sense of normalcy. The waitress listened quietly as he tried to explain, her expression unreadable. When he mentioned the Pinewood Motel, her face tightened. She told him it had burned down 10 years ago, killing the night clerk who'd been working alone. No one ever rebuilt it, and most people avoided the area entirely. David sat there, hands trembling, trying to piece together what had happened, when she asked if he was sure he'd stayed there. He started to say yes, but then remembered something. Digging into his wallet, he found the folded receipt from 2 nights before. His name, the room number, and a timestamp 2:14 a.m. were all there, along with a scrawled signature. It was the same pale handwriting he'd seen on the counter that night, but across the top, in faded red ink, were the words "paid in full, checkout, never." On winter nights, the old station felt like the loneliest place in the world. The train yard stretched out like a skeletal hand, its rusting rails vanishing into the fog, and the only sounds were the occasional groan of the wind against the corrugated metal roof and the distant clank of settling steel. Mark had been working security there for just under 2 months, and while the quiet could be unnerving, it was steady work, an easy paycheck for walking the platforms, checking locks, and keeping drunks from wandering onto the tracks. That night, the snow came down in soft, relentless sheets, muffling every sound until even his own footsteps felt muted. The station was shut for maintenance until morning, and aside from Mark, no one was supposed to be there. The large brass clock above the ticket booth read 2:37 a.m., its pendulum swaying lazily, the rhythmic tick echoing in the empty hall. Mark had just poured himself a coffee in the staff room when the radio on his belt hissed with static. At first, he thought it was interference from the storm, but then he caught a few garbled words, something about approaching on track 3. That was impossible. There were no scheduled arrivals until 6:00 a.m., and track 3 had been closed for weeks due to a broken switch. Frowning, he stepped onto the platform, his breath hanging in the frozen air. That's when he heard it, a low, distant rumble. It grew steadily, accompanied by the faint metallic screech of wheels on rails. The fog at the far end of the track began to glow with a dim yellow light. The train emerged slowly, like a figure stepping out of a dream. It was unlike any train Mark had ever seen, its engine an old soot-black steam locomotive, the carriages behind it long and narrow with frosted windows and gold trim dulled by age. It glided to a stop with an almost supernatural silence, the snow melting into steam where the wheels met the rails. Mark's first thought was that it had to be some sort of restoration project, maybe a historical reenactment. But there were no markings, no logos, no signs of modern maintenance. The clock above him read 2:45 a.m. He watched the doors of the nearest carriage slide open with a hiss. No one stepped out. He called into the train, his voice echoing unnaturally, but there was no answer. After a long moment, the doors closed again and the train began to move, except that as it did, the lights of the station flickered and everything around him seemed to stutter like a skipping film reel. When the lights steadied, the clock still read 2:45 a.m. His coffee, still in his hand, was just as hot as before. The rumble of the train faded into the fog, leaving only the quiet hiss of the snow. At first, Mark thought maybe he had imagined it, but then it happened again, and again. Each time the same sequence unfolded, the rumble, the light, the antique train gliding into the station, the doors opening without a passenger in sight, the clock freezing at 2:45. Sometimes, as he peered through the frosted glass of the windows, he thought he saw shapes, passengers seated stiffly, their heads bowed, their faces pale and indistinct. On the third occurrence, he swore he recognized one of them. His supervisor, sitting 2 rows back, wearing the same jacket he'd had on earlier that evening. The sight made him stumble back onto the platform, heart hammering in his chest. By the fourth arrival, the experience began to change. When the train stopped, the fog around it seemed thicker, and through the windows he could make out brief flashes of scenes that hadn't yet happened. He saw a man in a conductor's uniform shouting into a phone. He saw flames licking the walls of the station's signal control room. He saw himself standing on the platform, but in this vision his breath was still, and there was frost clinging to his eyelashes as though he'd been there for hours unmoving. The images would flicker and vanish, replaced by the empty seats. The clock never moved. Mark tried to break the cycle. The fifth time the train came, he walked to the far end of the platform before it arrived, but when the fog rolled in, it was still there in front of him, hissing softly. The sixth time, he smashed the glass face of the station clock with his baton, sending brass gears tumbling to the floor. But when he looked again, the clock was intact, swinging its pendulum lazily toward 2:45. His radio, too, offered no escape. Each loop began with the same garbled transmission about approaching on track 3, no matter what he did. On the seventh arrival, something inside him snapped. As the doors slid open, Mark stepped inside. The air was colder than he expected, his breath crystallizing instantly. The passengers didn't look at him, but their eyes shifted slightly, following him in unison as he walked down the aisle. Every seat was occupied, yet no one moved. Their skin was gray, their lips pale, and their clothes were decades out of date. The only sound was a faint whispering, but it wasn't in any language he recognized. It was backwards, like a tape rewinding. At the far end of the carriage stood the conductor, tall and impossibly thin, his uniform immaculate but his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. "You've arrived tomorrow," the conductor said in a voice that seemed to bypass Mark's ears entirely and land straight in his skull. "Now you belong here." His gloved hand closed around Mark's wrist with a grip like ice. The station outside blurred into a gray smear, and the doors shut with a final, hollow thud. No one saw Mark after that night. In the morning, the maintenance crew found his coffee cup sitting on the bench, still faintly warm, his radio lying beside it. The CCTV footage showed him standing on the platform at 2:45 a.m., watching something approach that wasn't visible on camera. But when they reviewed footage from the previous week, there he was again in the exact same place at the exact same time, over and over, stretching back months. And in each frame, his breath hung in the air. as if time inside station had frozen just for him. It was early February when Jordan and Melissa set out for the farmhouse. The four of them had been friends since college, bound together by a shared taste for the strange and unexplained, the kind of people who planned road trips around ghost stories instead of landmarks. They had heard about the place from a gas station attendant 2 towns over. A hushed warning slipped into casual conversation. "Don't go near the house," he'd said, glancing at the empty road outside. "They say an hour inside can cost you years or take them away entirely." Of course, that only made them more determined. By the time they found the long dirt drive, the sun had already slipped behind a thick veil of clouds, casting the frozen fields in shades of bruised gray. The house appeared gradually, a hulking silhouette at the end of the lane, its roof sagging under decades of neglect. The front porch listed to one side, and frost clung to the warped wood like a thin layer of ash. Inside the foyer, the air was different, dense, still, with a faint metallic taste that clung to the back of the throat. The first thing they noticed was the grandfather clock against the far wall. Its pendulum swung erratically, faster than it should, ticking in sharp bursts before slowing almost to a stop, then snapping forward again. Jordan laughed uneasily and tapped the face of his watch, only to see the second hand spinning wildly. Melissa checked her phone, but the screen flickered and froze before she could open the camera. They exchanged glances, and no one said it out loud, but they all felt it. Time in here was wrong. They moved cautiously from room to room, each space revealing some new layer of decay. Wallpaper sagged in wet strips, the pattern beneath barely visible through the mold. In the kitchen, a row of mason jars sat on the counter, each one filled with cloudy water and something floating inside, dolls' eyes maybe, or marbles dulled by age. As they lingered, noticed something odd outside the cracked window. The sky was dimming far faster than it should have. The sun, which had been high when they arrived, now hovered just above the horizon, its light thick and syrupy. "We've only been here 20 minutes, said, but her voice was tight, as if she didn't believe her own words. That was when Jordan's hair caught their attention. He had a few days' worth of stubble when they arrived, but now a thin beard shadowed his jaw and the strands at his temples looked noticeably grayer. "This isn't funny," he muttered, rubbing at his face as though he could wipe the change away. Melissa, meanwhile, complained that her phone battery had gone from 90% to dead in seconds. Swore he saw something moving in the reflection of the hallway mirror, a figure slipping into the next room, even though the others were all standing beside him. They followed the movement to a narrow doorway leading to the basement. The stairs were steep, the wood creaking like an old ship underfoot. At the bottom, the air was colder, heavy with the smell of damp earth. Shelves lined the walls, holding stacks of brittle newspapers and glass jars filled with yellowed photographs. Picked one up and felt the blood drain from her face. It was a picture of the four of them standing in the very room they were in now, but they were older. Much older. Lines etched their faces, and Jordan's hair was entirely white. On the back, written in looping script, was a date, February 8th, 2041. They set the photo down in silence, each of them feeling the weight of something shift inside the room. That was when Melissa began to scream. Turned to see her clutching her arm, skin pale as parchment, veins dark and raised. She swore she'd felt something pull at her, not physically, but from inside, a sensation of being yanked forward at impossible speed. When they tried to lead her back upstairs, the climb seemed to stretch, each step taking longer than the last. By the time they reached the ground floor, Melissa's hair had streaks of white through it, and her hands trembled like an elderly woman. Outside the windows, the sky was now pitch black. Stars scattered across it as if night had swallowed the day in one gulp. They didn't speak about staying together, they just knew they had to get out. But the front door, which had been just steps from the foyer, seemed farther away now, the hallway stretching out like a tunnel. The grandfather clock's ticking grew louder, erratic, then slowed until each sounded minutes apart. Jordan reached the door first, yanking it open, but instead of the field outside, there was only blinding white light. It pulsed once, and he was gone, and froze, their screams catching in their throats. Melissa, too weak to run, reached for the doorknob and vanished in the same burst of light. Grabbed's hand, pulling her toward the back of the house, hopping for another way out. They stumbled into the kitchen, but it was different now. The counters were covered in dust, the jars cracked and empty, the wallpaper peeled to reveal bare, splintering wood. Outside, through the window, the frost-covered field was gone, replaced by tall, wild grass swaying in warm summer air. Swatch said it was 3:06 p.m., but the date read August 14, 1972. The sound of the clock from the foyer carried into the kitchen, though now it sounded slower than a heartbeat, as if the house itself was winding down. In the end, only made it out. She stumbled through a side door into the warm sunlight, collapsing in the field. A man on a tractor spotted her and drove over, his expression darkening when she told him where she'd been. He explained the place had burned down decades ago, though sometimes, on the right kind of day, you could still find it standing, waiting. She asked if anyone had ever come back after going inside. The man shook his head. Not the same as they went in, he said. A month later, returned to the area, determined to find answers. But when she walked the dirt lane, there was nothing at the end but an empty clearing. Still, in her jacket pocket, she carried the photograph from the basement, the one with the four of them older and lined with age. And each time she looked at it, she swore the image had changed. Jordan and Melissa seemed to be fading, their outlines softening into the background, while she herself looked a little more tired. A little more worn, as if the house had found a way to keep pulling her back, one stolen second at a time. And that brings us to the end of tonight's final story. 3 unsettling accounts where time itself seemed to twist and break under the weight of something not of this world. Whether you believe these events are tricks of the mind, glitches in reality, or something far more sinister, one thing is certain. Once you step into places like these, you can never truly be sure of how much time you've lost or how much you've got left. If you enjoyed sinking into the eerie shadows with me tonight, make sure to hit that like button. It lets me know you want more nights like this. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more real stories waiting, and you don't want to miss the next time we step into the strange together. Until then, keep your clocks close, your lights on, and your sense of time very, very sharp. And that brings us to the end of tonight's final story. 3 unsettling accounts where time itself seemed to twist and break under the weight of something not of this world. Whether you believe these events are tricks of the mind, glitches in reality, or something far more sinister, one thing is certain. Once you step into places like these, you can never truly be sure of how much time you've lost or how much you've got left. If you enjoyed sinking into the eerie shadows with me tonight, make sure to hit that like button. It lets me know you want more nights like this. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more real stories waiting, and you don't want to miss the next time we step into the strange together. Until then, keep your clocks close, your lights on, and your sense of time very, very sharp.